Hey, hello, how are you? This is a show for everyone else. Instead of going after top 1% of the world, we dedicate this podcast to celebrate the lives of the unsung heroes and self-made artists. Hi there, you're listening to the Feisworld podcast. This is your host, Fei Wu. Today on the show, we have Aaron Keith Hawkins, who is an FBI agent and also a podcaster, an author, and an executive coach. I think you brought up a really important point, which is a number of points. The last one, in terms of finding our own voice and, how unique do you need it to be? Sometimes we feel like we found it. It's like, but wait a minute, am I trying to sound like Seth Godin? Am I trying to, copy somebody else? I think it's that, like you said, it's an iteration, and a lot of people don't realize that. And I think, last night when I was at a barbecue party, I was trying to, having this great conversation with this 23-year-old about writing. And my main message to him is that please write and hit the publish button. And you're not going to necessarily find it tonight or tomorrow, 30 days from now. I mean, it's a long time for young millennials these days, but it's a process. And I also encourage people, I'm sure, Aaron, you've been blogging and posting for a while, and sometimes we go back to our earlier work, and even episode 1, you're like, oh, I still want to delete this. But I can't because it's part of the show. And I think that is the process. And how many times in our lives for us to do something and see the trace of it, right? Like, for you being a parent, there are pictures taken with your adorable young daughter, there are conversations that you remember. But with the podcast, it's kind of a similar thing, that you see the growth of yourself. So that is something, I think it's really powerful. And I want people to not feel bad about that. I think it's one of the message I have. In terms of something else you said about the website, I was like, I want to say something because that's sort of what I do. And I see a lot of people not having a website because they feel like it doesn't live up to their expectation. And they're maybe right most of the time. What I was really impressed about is that you built this whole thing by yourself. Is that right?
I did. Yeah, I did.
Oh my God. Your background, if I assume, it's not in digital marketing or advertising.
No, I'm an accidental website builder. It's one of those things. One of the things, and I'll give some props to Brendan Bouchard, who I've never met, but I've learned a lot from him. I think I've read every one of his books. But one of the things I heard him say years ago that wedged into my brain was that you have to believe in your ability to figure anything out. So almost everything on my website, everything I've done to this point is something that just several years back, I was clueless about. And if I'm honest, these days, I still feel plenty clueless about any number of unlimited things. But along the way, I've forced myself to figure things out. So and thank you. I built my entire website on my own.
WordPress or Squarespace?
I'm sorry, WordPress. Yeah, WordPress. Yeah, so it's and again, to your point, it was a process because the first version, my Amazon 1.0 version of my website, if I were to look at it today, it was I would be embarrassed. I would only show someone these days just to say, look at how bad I was. And it was okay. I think if we put what we're talking about here in a nutshell, we have to humble ourselves enough to be willing to suck at something, if I can say that. Like, we have to be willing to say, I'm going to start, even if it sucks, because probably every version of my website up to this one, I was not even remotely happy with. I was in some ways embarrassed by it, but I had a website. And there were people that came there, and there were people that were thanking me for some of the content was on there. And even though it wasn't perfect. I was in a process of improving. And if we're willing to, we have to be humble enough, because a lot of times I think and you can tell me your thoughts on this, Faye, a lot of times if we're honest, and I know I said I'm not Gary Vee, but I'm going to be kind of blunt right now. A lot of times our ego sets us up for failure because we're not willing to have anything that's less than perfect. So if my website doesn't look like so-and-so's, then forget it. I'm not just doing it all. And that is, you lose before you even start if we take that stance. Like you mentioned early podcast episodes, I won't even listen to some of I don't even want to hear some of my earlier episodes because I'm like, I don't want to listen to that again, because I know how clueless I was. Not to say I'm anything great now, but I don't even go back there. It happened. I'm not ashamed of it, but it's what I was. But I've progressed from there. But, we have to be willing to take that journey.
A week ago, I decided to listen to episode 1 with Caleb Brown, and I prepared myself for awfulness. And I was, in a way, pleasantly surprised. I realized, especially the intro, right? I was okay once I get to the conversation part. I was like, oh, I don't want to hear the intro again. Like, hello. Like, I imagine me talking slowly, scared for no reason, and bored, scared, or lonely because I knew exactly which part of the house I recorded this in with the wrong equipment. And then I realized, like, it wasn't so bad. And somebody even said to me on purpose to say that when I was already more than 100 episodes in, somebody emailed me, reached out to me and said, oh, I went to episode 1 on purpose. I just want to see how far you've gone. You've come, right?
Yeah.
And when he said that, I was like, no. And why did you have to do that? And I realized, well, this person has a point, and I want him or her to see that. And I use these example all the time, like all the super sexy YouTubers with their 14, 20 million followers. Go back to their first video. Some of them do delete them, which is terrible and a shame. But if you go back to their first video, you cannot believe how far they've come. I think that's such a beautiful thing, because what this vision or this picture we have in our mind, in terms of what's good or perfect, even that's wrong. Yeah. We don't even know, like using the simple example of writing or, web design, maybe everybody has a different point of view, right? Like, oh, that's pretty or, but when it comes to writing, everything we learned in school, not to say they were correct grammatically and everything, but that's not the type of content that will resonate and touch other people. Nobody talks like that. You can even notice in a TV show or movie when the script is over prepared and over scripted, and people just like, they're like robots.
It's robotic.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is true, and it's funny. I was mentioning a few things about influence, and one of the last is kind of on this point where it's a practice. One of the biggest mistakes people make when they're trying to be influential is they think that they need to already be that type of person that is influential. So they blame their personality, like, I'm not, nobody's gonna want to listen to my show or read my blog, or they're not going to want to be coached by me, or they're not going to want to buy my stuff because I'm just not that type of influential person. But influence is not about our personality. It's about what we're willing to practice and get better at. And by no means, I've always been very introverted by nature. If you saw me in a public place at a party, I was either off on my own while everybody's mingling, or I'd be with one or two. I feel more comfortable in smaller conversations. But like now, I'll get in front of an audience of I don't care how many people, and I'll just freely speak. I care less who's there, because it wasn't about who I was. It was what I decided to practice and train myself to be more comfortable with. And I'm sure you've gone through the same progression. Like you said, you went back to your first episode because you wanted to see the progression, which inherently means you knew you were intentionally making progress and you intentionally wanted to get better at the same thing. And I think that's an important thing for business owners or anybody, regardless of what somebody's doing. You could have a nonprofit or something that you wanted, some mission, something you wanted to get better at. Even if you're just a parent, you want to be a better parent. wherever you are now does not mean that's where you need to be a month from now or a year from now or even an hour from now. There's always the things you're doing and the impact you're having and creating is a matter of how much you're willing to learn and how much effort you're willing to put into getting better at whatever it is you want to achieve. And that's a big lesson that I wish a lot more people would. I wish I would have learned it quicker, but it's just something it took me a while to become aware of, which is why I kind of harp on it these days.
And I think that we need to change our perspectives and give ourselves a chance to learn while being an adult and to be able to make new friends, get to know people who we have a true connection with instead of people in friendship by proximity, whether you go to work and they have to be your friends. And, we all know that we won't just naturally connect with everyone and we sort of are forced in a certain situation. Yeah. So by proactively reaching out, whether it's through writing or blogging or podcasting, I think it's just a fantastic way of finding your tribe. And I can't say enough about that because people and energy and the wisdom that are generated from that tribe will fuel you and, for the rest of your life. Or if that's too much of a statement, will really fuel you in that, in an extended period of time, 5-10 years. Mm-hmm. I've only been doing this for 3.5. And my life has really, truly changed forever. And I can tell from your voice that starting your own business, running the podcast, I've also done the same for you. This is a pretty strong statement right there.
It is. And it's not, what you're saying is not an overstatement. I think you and I may have touched on this before in another conversation about, if you were to look back 5 years from now, it's almost like you can't recognize how things were then as compared to how they are now. That's certainly the case with me, because these relationships that I've built as I've practiced being willing to reach out to more people and being willing to have these conversations and being willing to ask for something, whether it's something that I can give or something that I need, that I want support with. Being willing to go through these progressions and engage in the bigger mission without worrying about whether somebody else will agree or disagree with it, and just knowing, okay, this is my ultimate goal. So, is this thing that I'm worried about doing, is it going to help me get to that? Is it going to serve that bigger picture? Is it going to serve that ultimate goal? And if the answer is yes, then, to quote Mel Robbins in the 5-second rule, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, okay, I need to do it. Send the email, make the call, ask the question, ask for the introduction, and just do it. And it's amazing how, like you said, your life can totally change forever just by being willing to keep stepping toward that direction. I love it.
Yeah. Hi there, you're listening to the Feisworld podcast. This is your host, Fei Wu. Today on the show, we have Aaron Keith Hawkins, who is an FBI agent and also a podcaster, an author, and an executive coach. I do want to talk about the SWAT team. And you mentioned to me like 2 days ago, I realized, what was it like? How long have you been, what are some of the tasks? Because I guess some of these are like high profile stories, but like, how did you become one? What is it? I've only seen it on TV and I don't know what it's all about, really.
All right, we'll do the quick rundown of that. So I was on the SWAT team for 15 years. Wound up leaving. I was when I left, I wound up being one of the team leaders. But that started a couple of years, back in the 90s. I'd been on the job a couple of years, and then I kind of got asked if I wanted to join a tactical team, and said yeah, because it sounded like the cool thing to do, the elite, so to speak, thing to do. And from there, it was a lot of training. We went a few different places around the country to study with some of the people from LAPD and stuff and learn hostage rescue tactics and all that kind of thing. So it was exciting, was definitely exciting. I was definitely around some of that experience, being with that environment, with those people that I was with, taught me a ton about standards, about raising it. And it kind of translates totally into this, the personal development, where it sounds insane. But my time on a SWAT team totally prepared me for this personal development world, because everything we did was about having this, we had very almost ridiculously high standards for everything we did. The movements, the way we flowed through a house or a building, if we had to make an entry and search for whoever it is, the armed robber, the murder suspect, whatever it was, everything had to be done, like your awareness had to be at 100. But it's very important that even though your awareness and your vision was at 100%, you couldn't be in a state of paranoia. You had to also, at the same time, with this hyper awareness, you had to be hyper relaxed. Like you had to be just in the flow of what needed to be done. And that came from, how do you get in the flow? Well, repetition takes time. So we would do our movements, we would do our work with our equipment and weapons and all this stuff, so that we always used the word surgical. Like everything we did, we wanted to be surgical about it, meaning very precise, intentional decisions. And that totally transitioned to my mindset now when it comes to having these very high standards of what I do. But does that mean there was perfection there? Of course not. No. But if you aim for that, then you're going to be pretty darn good if you make your standard to be ridiculously high. And that helped a lot prepare me for what I do now. Really did.
You talk about like the flow of things or doing things the same way. What does that mean? I mean, I am a huge fan of this TV show called The Unit.
Okay.
And it's, I think it's based on a book, Delta Force, written by this gentleman I happen to be friends with on Facebook. And I'm not really his friend.
It's one of the book on my shelf.
It's incredible. I thought and I think what's fascinating, and then typically I don't really watch a lot of army movies or shows, but this one happens to be like just so well curated and like shot together. And like, I think, a lot of brutality, but there's also a lot really emotional and sensitive to it. I think one thing that they talk about doing things the same way, including the way you walk into a room, the way that the team is organized, and then who's first, second, third, the way that what are some of the things I find those really fascinating?
Yeah, some of those, it's funny how one thing, I have to tip my cap sometimes to the film industry these days, both television and movies, because even though they are not realistic in the sense of all the over-the-top stuff that's almost obvious, sometimes there are times that I'll watch, and it really depends on the show, but there have been more times in recent years than in previous years that some of the tactics and the mindset and the stuff they do is a lot closer to reality than it was, in the 80s. If you watch some SWAT show in the 80s or 70s, everybody's jumping out of the back of the van and the hut, and they look like soldiers. And I look at it, I'm like, what is that? It's just the weirdest thing. But yes, to answer your question about flow, some of the things are, number one, like you said, it's a lot of repetition. And we got to the point where we literally could communicate, and we could clear a huge building, warehouse, anything without ever speaking a word. And we could tell each other what to do, what not to do, what we were worried about, simply with, a head gesture or a hand symbol. It was an entire language, and then predetermined movements based on that unspoken language and signals that would help us accomplish what we needed to do very quickly, almost without any friction amongst ourselves. Like we knew what needed to be done without speaking what needed to be done. So just little things like, always checking your corners, remembering that, you're in a 360-degree environment. So don't just look in front of you. You have to look down. You have to look up, because there could be a threat in any location. Like a lot of that stuff, and it became so natural, but it translates because, in business, like it's simply, if you break it down, it's a matter of setting rules and then practicing those rules intentionally over and over again. Well, think about that in business. I mean, the way you treat customers, how quickly you respond to an email, how you schedule your next day or don't schedule your next day, depending on those habits and those rules that you set up, and how committed you are to following through with them, that creates flow. And either you're not doing those things that need to be done, and then it becomes a negative flow, like you just create habits that aren't useful, or in this case, like we became very committed to movements and communication, so that they became second nature, and they kept us safe. Like 15 years, we never took a life, and we never lost one. In my little, it was a relatively small part of the world, but it certainly worked. It certainly worked for us.
I mean, New Jersey, New York, the area, it's not exactly free from crimes. I mean, you're not, you know what I mean? Like when I think Chris Voss also worked in New York back in the early 90s, 80s. And he said he went through a phase of like people walking up to him and he's ready to fight, and which is not the case anymore these days. But one thing I noticed that people probably will ask you a lot is like, oh, why don't you teach self-defense? Or I think a better question is, how do those skills potentially translate to our day-to-day activities? Yeah. I don't know whether you've ever encountered outside of work, once you're in a dark alley or you're maybe with your family walking around like unfamiliar town. Like, what do you do in that situation?
Yeah, for me, I was never one of those people where that career really took over my home life. So like one of the best pieces of advice I got many years ago was from one of the guys I used to work with. He's retired now, but he told me when I got married back in 1996, he said, whatever you do, if you listen to nothing else I ever say, do not take this job home with you. And I knew before I even started a job, I knew that I didn't want my identity to be attached to the career. That was just never who I was. I never wanted that to be my identity, to the point where if somebody introduced me as a cop, I would get so pissed off. Because to me, it was like, okay, if I were an insurance salesman, you would have not introduced me as, hi, this is my friend Aaron, he's an insurance salesman. It just doesn't happen. But it was weird because in my career, not everyone, but a lot of people would introduce me as that. And I developed, for a while, it's not there anymore, but for a while, I had this self-consciousness about it, where I didn't want to be associated with that. I wanted people to get to know me, not me because they had assumptions about who I was because of what I did for a living. But little things that did carry over, like if we go to restaurants, I never wanted to be seated with my back to the door. I always wanted to be seated facing the door because, I mean, we all know how insane society can be. If something like that were to happen, I wanted to immediately see it before it played out, because I inherently notice things that a lot of times that are out of place. But I want to be in a position to see it first. Little stuff like that helps. What really helps, that can transition to our listeners. One of the things that I learned, one of the best skills I learned, of the many skills I learned being on that SWAT team for so many years, was visualization. There's a lot of, in the self-help world, a lot of people talk about visualizing your goal or visualizing what you want your life to be. And people do that. They'll say, picture the house you want to live in, and where do you want it to be, what country, what does your bank account look like, and all that kind of stuff. And visualizing that end goal, which in my experience isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but I think it misses the point, because what we did a lot of was visualizing the process. So in other words, if we knew we had a pre-planned event and we were going to look for person X in this home, and we think he's usually in this area of the home, like we would have all these things played out. We knew that the end goal was to detain this person without anyone getting hurt. That was a goal. But we didn't visualize standing in a room still with him on the ground, handcuffed. That didn't help. I mean, visualizing that isn't going to help you get there. What does help is you visualizing, okay, step A, how are we approaching? What's our route? Step B, what are we going to see when we get out of our transport? Step C, what's our entry point? Where are we going once we get through that? We're visualizing every single step along the way. Where are the potential threats? who else is in the home. We're visualizing everything up until the point where the goal is accomplished. The goal accomplished was almost irrelevant. That was never, for me, it was never part of my visualization, was not, yay, we arrested him. Like, that was never even a thought. My process, and literally with eyes closed, we would, almost like meditating, when we were transporting on the way to do a job, you would see umpteen big dudes all geared up with automatic weapons with their eyes closed, and you just see their heads bobbing, because we were visualizing the process of what it was going to take to accomplish that goal safely. That is what I think is missing from a lot of people in the business world. Everybody has their vision boards with their episode on Oprah, and jet skiing with Richard Branson, and all that kind of stuff, which is great. Don't get me wrong. I'm not speaking negatively against those things, because I have friends that did some vision boards, and they have some amazing stories about what they accomplished after having done that. But the more important, what actually makes the difference is being intentional and visualizing what's the next thing I'm going to have to do to get there? What is every step along the way? How am I going to get it done? What is likely to get in my way? When those obstacles happen, how do I overcome them? And I think that type of visualization is what gets it done. Whereas if you're just looking at the white sandy beaches and forgetting about there's a whole lot of travel to do before you get there, that's what gets people frustrated, because I've known plenty of people that say, it's been 6 months since I've started visualizing, I'm still not there. I'm like, well, how much of the process did you visualize? Like, what are your steps along the way?
Yeah. And then also, I think the mentality that you guys have, it's so many people think about only the obstacles and risk, and they don't take a single step. But for you guys, there is, and it's that's the art of the balance, really, is to be able to predict some of them, and knowing that you might not be perfect and all the way right to the T, and but not be paralyzed by those obstacles and still be able to move forward. I think, my goodness, that's like why people like Seth Godin and Brian Koppelman exist. I mean, that's kind of what they teach. And that journey, and you've lived through it, like you said, 2 decades, and that's already that's part of it's like in your blood, like it's part of your DNA.
Sure it is.
Yeah, and to be able to teach that because you've lived through it, and this is so awesome. Thank you for spending another 15 minutes. I think your listeners in particular will love what you just talked about.
Yeah, you drew that. See, I love that we did this, because that's not something that I would have chose to talk about on Unbreakable Success. So thank you for kind of helping me to share a little bit about myself and my world, that my listeners.
Definitely thanks to Feisworld listeners, but also Aaron's listeners, and I hope that you get so much out of who you are. You're this super friendly, down to earth guy. You got this natural instinct about you, and the feeling you project onto your customers, other people, I think is there to be shared with the world. So I'm so glad.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your kind words, Faye. Honestly, I appreciate that very much. It's both humbling and flattering. And for sure, I'm very grateful to have met you. Thanks again to Jocelyn for introducing us, and love what you're up to. Love the show. And your willingness to take that journey that you took, and we should get into it more next time. But your journey from where you were and coming over to the States and deciding to plant your flag here, I'm glad that you stuck around and are doing what you're doing in the world today, because it's definitely making an impact. So I appreciate you.
Hi there, it's me again. I want to thank you very much for listening to this episode, and I hope you were able to learn a few things. If you enjoyed what you heard, it would be hugely helpful if you could subscribe to the Feisworld podcast. It literally takes seconds. If you're on your mobile phone, just search for Feisworld podcast in the podcast app on iPhone or an Android app such as Podcast Addict, and click subscribe. All new episodes will be delivered to you automatically. Thanks so much for your support.